It's 1965 in Greenwich Village, and inside a limo on a cold night, two of folk music's brightest stars are about to have a falling out. One of them is about to be kicked to the curb, his confidence shattered by just a few brutal words from his friend. That friend was Bob Dylan, and his insult would ignite one of the most personal rivalries of his legendary career. While Dylan was hailed as the voice of a generation, not everyone was singing his praises. In fact, some of music's biggest icons really couldn't stand him. And tonight, we're naming names. Bob Dylan. The name itself is an institution. A poet with a guitar, a Nobel laureate who dropped out of college, the reluctant prophet of a turbulent era. For over 60 years, he's been a ghost in the machine of popular music, a figure of almost terrifying influence. His songs have been anthems for marches, soundtracks for revolutions, and a comfort for lonely souls. He is, without a doubt, one of the most important artists of the last century. But behind the myth, there's another story. It's a story of an artist so uncompromising, with a personality so cryptic and prickly, that he rubbed some of his most famous peers the wrong way. These weren't just spats over chart positions. They were deeply personal, philosophical battles over the very soul of music. So tonight, we're looking at the shocking rivalries and bitter disagreements that turned music's biggest icons against the voice of a generation. These are the top 6 musicians who clashed with Bob Dylan. Coming in at number 6 is a conflict that didn't play out in the press but in the quiet of the recording studio. The musician in question is Al Kooper, and while his name might not be as famous as Dylan's, his fingerprints are all over some of the most iconic sounds of the 60s and 70s. Kooper is the guy who improvised the legendary organ riff on Like a Rolling Stone after bluffing his way into the session. He was a key architect of that thin, wild Mercury sound on landmark albums like Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. They weren't best friends. That wasn't really Dylan's style. But they had a deep musical respect. After Blonde. On Blonde, Kooper's career took off. He formed Blood, Sweat and Tears and became a sought-after producer. So when Dylan was reeling from the critical beatdown of his album, Self-Portrait, he called his old collaborator to produce his next record, New Morning. Kooper came in hoping to help Dylan recapture that mid-60s magic. He envisioned a masterpiece. He quickly discovered he was working with a very different Bob Dylan. The friction started almost immediately. Kooper, the meticulous producer, wanted to craft the album with overdubs, horn sections, and multiple takes to get it perfect. Dylan, however, was in a raw, almost defiant mood. He wanted the album to feel immediate and organic, not polished. The tension simmered. Kooper would spend days arranging horn parts, only for Dylan to casually reject them. In his memoir, Kooper described a maddening process where Dylan seemed indecisive, constantly changing his mind about the songs. The weeks dragged on, and as Kooper put it, it was driving him nuts. Kooper felt Dylan wasn't giving the project his all, while Dylan likely saw Kooper as trying to impose a commercial sheen on something personal. The frustration hit a boiling point, and Kooper walked away from the project before it was finished. While New Morning was released to decent reviews, it wasn't the masterpiece Kooper had imagined. Professionally, their relationship cooled. Significantly, there was no public blowout, but they never worked together with that same intensity again. The quiet conflict over New Morning exposed a fundamental clash in their artistic approaches and left a scar on their collaboration. Our next entry involves not just one musician, but an entire institution, the Grateful Dead. On the surface, a team-up between these two titans of the counterculture seemed like a dream. Dylan, the master songwriter, the Grateful Dead, the masters of live improvisation. They shared a history in the folk scene and a mutual respect, especially between Dylan and Jerry Garcia. In the summer of 1987, they decided to make it a reality, with a joint stadium tour. It was billed as a historic meeting of musical minds. It ended up being a legendary train wreck. The problem came down to a clash of philosophies. The Grateful Dead were famous for their long, exploratory jams. Their music was a living thing that changed every single night. Dylan, while known for being spontaneous, still believed that songs needed structure. From the start, things were chaotic. Rehearsals were reportedly a mess, and once the tour started, Dylan would often call out songs the Dead hadn't even prepared for. But the real issue was the jamming. Dylan grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the Dead's musical meandering. He respected Garcia's musicianship, but he felt the band's improvisational style often went nowhere. He believed they were stripping the folk tradition of its soul and replacing it with a kind of feel-good escapism. The result was a string of concerts that critics panned as musically incoherent. The accompanying live album, Dylan and the Dead, is widely considered a low point for everyone involved. The fallout was significant. While there was no public feud, the experience seemed to sour Dylan on the whole jam band ethos. There's a long circulating, though disputed, story that Dylan later asked to formally join the Grateful Dead, only to be vetoed by bassist Phil Lesh. Whether it's true or not, it speaks to the weird, strained dynamic between them. He saw them as brilliant musicians who had lost the plot. And for a storyteller like Bob Dylan, that was an artistic crime he couldn't get behind. Some rivalries are born from betrayal, others from creative differences. But the tension between Bob Dylan and Lou Reed was a clash of two of rock and roll, poetry's most brilliant and most difficult practitioners. They were like the twin towers of New York's lyrical landscape in the 60s. Dylan was the folk messiah from Minnesota, and Reed was the gritty, streetwise leader of the Velvet Underground, chronicling the city's dark underbelly. They moved in the same circles, but their egos and their vastly different styles made a collision almost inevitable. While Dylan had electrified the folk tradition, Reed was something else entirely. He was avant-garde, noisy, and unflinching in his songs about drug addiction and sexuality, topics that made Dylan's poetry seem almost quaint. Reed saw himself as the true pioneer and wasn't shy about saying so. The simmering tension boiled over in a 1974 interview when Reed took a direct shot at Dylan, claiming his lyrics were all smoke and mirrors and dismissing him as a pretentious poet. He essentially argued that he was the real deal, and Dylan's persona was just an act. For a guy like Dylan, whose entire identity was built on authenticity, this was a major challenge to his legacy. Dylan's response? Absolute silence. From that point on, Lou Reed's name seemed to vanish from Dylan's world. He was absent from interviews, liner notes, and speeches where Dylan would praise his peers. It was as if Lou Reed, a fellow giant of the art form, had simply ceased to exist. In Dylan's world, this wasn't just forgetting, it was a deliberate cold shoulder. The silence was deafening and lasted for decades. While there's some evidence they mellowed over time, the damage was done. Lou Reed had the audacity to suggest Dylan wasn't the only game in town, and that was a transgression Dylan couldn't just brush off. He didn't need to fight back with words. He simply removed Reed from the history he was writing. This next one is maybe the most personal and legendary of them all. It's a story of love, betrayal, and a deep philosophical divide that tore apart the reigning king and queen of the 1960s folk movement, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. In the early days, they were inseparable. Baez was already the queen of folk, and when she first heard a scruffy, unknown Dylan in 1961, she was captivated. She became his champion, inviting him on stage during her own sold-out shows and introducing his songs to her massive audience. They sang together at the March on Washington, a perfect symbol of the era's idealism. But as Dylan's star rose with meteoric speed, the partnership began to crumble. The boy she had nurtured was quickly becoming one of the biggest stars in the world, and he didn't need her help anymore. The first major crack appeared during Dylan's 1965 tour of England. He invited Baez along, but in a cruel reversal of their early years, he rarely asked her to perform with him. The woman who had introduced him to the world was now stuck on the sidelines. Their romance ended on that tour. The personal betrayal was rooted in a deeper conflict. As Dylan went electric and his songs became more surreal and personal, Baez felt he was abandoning the political cause they had shared. She saw his artistic evolution as an act of selfishness and publicly urged him to return to his protest roots. Dylan, in turn, saw her pleas as a failure to understand his new direction. He wasn't singing for a movement anymore. He was singing for himself. This created a rift that lasted for years. While they famously reunited for the Rolling Thunder Revue tour in the mid-1970s, the ideological wounds never fully healed. Baez later wrote the song Diamonds and Rust, a beautiful but bittersweet reflection on their relationship. Theirs was a feud born not of simple hatred, but of a profound and painful disappointment. Before we get to our top 2 most shocking conflicts, if you're enjoying this deep dive into music history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming up next. The artists on our list so far have criticized Dylan's choices, his persona, identity. This was a clash between 2 of the most revered songwriters of the 20th century, Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell. Like Dylan, Mitchell was a singular talent who redefined the singer-songwriter genre. For years, critics and fans lumped them together as the 2 great wordsmiths of their generation. It was a comparison that Joni Mitchell absolutely hated. For Mitchell, who prided herself on originality, being mentioned in the same breath as Dylan wasn't a compliment, it was an insult. She saw a huge difference between them. She believed she was creating from the heart, while she viewed Dylan as a construct, a persona, and most damningly of all, an imitator. The resentment exploded in a now infamous 2010 interview with the Los Angeles Times. When the interviewer mentioned Dylan, Mitchell launched into a brutal takedown. "Bob is not authentic at all," she declared. "He's a plagiarist, and his name and voice are fake. Everything about Bob is a deception. We are like night and day, he and I." It was a shocking statement from one giant about another. She was accusing him of being a fraud, claiming he'd borrowed his voice from old hillbillies and invented a character to deliver his songs. To Mitchell, who poured her own raw vulnerability into her music, this was the ultimate artistic sin. The plagiarism accusation was especially cutting. Scholars have noted that Dylan, in the grand folk tradition, often borrowed melodies and lyrics from older songs, something he's defended as part of the art form. But Mitchell saw it as theft. Her comments sent shockwaves through the music world. While she later tried to soften them, clarifying that she meant he wasn't musically gifted in a traditional sense, the original sting of plagiarist and fake lingered. Dylan, in typical fashion, never responded. But the comment highlighted a central debate about his art that continues to this day. Is he a true original or a brilliant synthesizer? Joni Mitchell made her opinion brutally clear, and here we are at number 1. This story brings us full circle, back to that cold night, in a New York City limo. This isn't about superstars clashing in the press. It's a more intimate and, in many ways, more tragic story about the moment a friendship was shattered by ambition and ego. This is the story of Bob Dylan and Phil Ochs. In the early 60s, if Dylan was the poet king of the topical song movement, Phil Ochs was its president. Ochs was a singing journalist, a passionate songwriter whose work was direct, political, and fiercely idealistic. He and Dylan were friends and rivals at the epicenter of a cultural explosion. They respected each other, but there was always an undercurrent of competition. The tension erupted on that fateful night. The two were riding in a limo when Dylan, excited about a new song he'd just recorded, played it for Ochs. After it finished, Dylan asked for his opinion. Ochs, always honest, told him the song was okay but probably wasn't commercial enough to be a hit. Dylan's reaction was swift and merciless. He ordered the driver to stop the car. He then turned to Ox and uttered the words that have gone down in folk legend. "You're not a folk singer. You're a journalist." And with that, he kicked a stunned Phil Ox out of the car and onto the street. For Oaks, who proudly called himself a singing journalist, to hear his idol use that as a weapon against him was devastating. He later said, "It was incredibly upsetting to be told his efforts were in vain." That single, brutal dismissal marked a turning point. Ox watched with a mix of awe and resentment as Dylan transcended the folk scene, leaving the political causes they once shared behind. Oaks, meanwhile, remained committed to his principles, a decision that likely cost him mainstream success. He continued to write powerful songs but was plagued by personal demons and a growing sense of disillusionment. The taxi incident became a symbol of everything that separated them. Dylan had chosen art over activism. For Phil Ox, a man of deep conviction, being cast aside so cruelly by his friend and hero was a blow from which he never fully recovered. So there you have it. From studio battles to public accusations and personal betrayals, the story of Bob Dylan is also the story of his conflicts. These 6 relationships reveal a common thread, an almost religious devotion to his own artistic vision, no matter who it alienated. Whether it was a producer, a peer, or a former lover, Dylan's response to being questioned was often swift and absolute. He built walls, he gave the silent treatment, and he never shied away from severing ties. These stories don't diminish his genius. If anything, they just add another layer of complexity to the man. They show the immense pressure, fierce competition, and fragile egos that defined a revolutionary time in music. Dylan has been called a prophet, a poet, and a plagiarist, a hero and a sellout. But above all, he has remained unapologetically himself. And in a world of compromise, perhaps that unwavering, sometimes brutal commitment to his own truth is the most enduring part of his legacy. What do you think? Which of these rivalries shocked you the most? Are there any other artists you think should have been on this list? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more hidden stories about your favorite musicians, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.